about Module 1. So I think I wrapped off. I wanted to mention, I talked about some federal initiatives about municipal and rural broadband or internet access. And I mentioned that this, and I didn't have off the top of my head the name of the act, but it was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act about 10 years ago. And an example given here, it's actually fairly big, 126 million to West Virginia to work on rural internet initiatives, and there's also been grants given away to kind of inner city, where it's kind of designed for wherever there's low income people who don't have access for whatever reason to internet, and in these areas. You can see here they're focusing on schools, libraries, and hospitals. And as I mentioned, in the kind of digital divide literature, there's a lot written about, well, the real challenge is helping people who don't really understand how they can use the internet to develop their career possibilities in social and economic power in general. And those type of things, those type of programs take a long time to develop. And a lot of human power, and I think are granted. You have to have the infrastructure, but after that, people aren't always going to know how to use it or how to get that access. And then one thing as we're getting into net neutrality, and so a lot of the conversation, the discussion talked about the difference between Title I and Title II that were established in the 1934 Communications Act, and Title II being defining the common carriers. I have a friend who's a economics professor, and he kind of clued me into how a lot of people from that kind of mindset. It's similar to some of the arguments that some of you made, are very much kind of dubious of regulation, in favor of the least possible restrictions for private enterprise to be innovated, and the least but still recognize that sometimes regulation is necessarily. And he sent me this article by a colleague of his that just kind of sets out, if you're going to tell me that net neutrality is really important and that really needs to be defined as a common carrier, and here's what you would need to do to convince me. And in some of the reading, kind of notes that the definition of internet services as being Title I to Title II has kind of shifted back and forth several times from the FCC. Since the late 1990s, and sometimes it's kind of implicit, and sometimes it's explicit. So, like with the Trump administration coming on and saying, okay, now it's really going to be Title I, and some of the arguments that some of these free market kind of people, advocates, say was that Title I still gives power for the FCC and Congress to step in. When they notice that something is being anti-competitive or where customers are not getting what they need. I think it's kind of one of the ironies that I see, and it's going to be kind of fleshed more out in Module 4 when we talk about the freedom of speech, is that similar, and some of you talked about this too, when broadcast came out, and there's lots of scare by the Congress and by the executive branch about, what's this new thing, and children are going to have access to this, and we got to regulate it. And the same thing happened in the mid and late 1990s with the internet, and it happened more so over the issue of common carrier and more on the issue of freedom of speech. So, and Reno versus ACLU was the big landmark that found most aspects of the Communications Decency Act, I believe in 1996, unconstitutional. And the issue here was the big scare over pornography, and we'll talk more about that again. I'll have a lecture or some things to say about it in a video in Module 4. But basically the law said that if a website couldn't make sure that someone under 18 could not have access, or could stop them from getting access to their website that might have some sort of indecent material on it, then they couldn't have that website up at all. And of course the courts found that unconstitutional. In the 50s, 60s, and 60s, the court slowly, through a series of rulings, changed the definition of obscenity, and things like Hustler and Playboy and those kind of magazines, not suddenly, but over a course of time, became constitutional, were no longer considered obscenity, and the same thing with pornographic films. And so by the time the internet issues came along, like these issues of how we're going to decide obscenity were well established, and the level of what adults in the United States were considered to be able to have a right to access was much greater than it used to be. And so when the court saw this, they were like, well, of course you can't do this, because there's no way for them to stop children from doing it, and by doing that you're stopping adults from accessing things that they might want to access that are perfectly constitutional. And so the thing that I think is kind of ironic is that if we think that, and in fact in this other case that's more recent kind of reiterated that idea. So yeah, 2017, and of course a case, Packingham versus North Carolina. North Carolina law wanted to say that they're not going to give sex offenders and prisoners access to social media, and the court's coming in and saying, no, you can't do that, because, and I think it says here, a fundamental First Amendment principle, people should be able to access to places where they can speak and listen and reflect, and basically have exercise their freedom of speech rights. And this was by Justice Kennedy in that case. And so the internet and those type of services be given like the highest level of protection, similar to print publications. And I think it's ironic that if we see these services as being so important, then why wouldn't they be considered common carriers, right? So if the ISP is just giving you that access, but no, they're not. They're considered, so with Title I, you know, we're going to consider them special services, or later they can consider them informational services. I just think that's really kind of ironic that we get that freedom of through the freedom of the press and not through the common carrier. Well, how are you going to get those services if they're not? But then the people who are free market people were saying, well, there will be a way, right? So you know, I've looked at some of the arguments that have come out recently of whether or not ISPs are in fact without net neutrality, trying to take advantage of that. And there's some articles you'll find out there, but none of them really give really compelling cases, and they tend to be not very biased, the arguments that ISPs are now trying to charge Netflix more, for example, for all the bandwidth use, or they're trying to favor some customers over others. And one of the arguments that's saying, well, who cares about that, are people saying, well, look what's happening with the low orbit internet, satellite internet initiatives, right? So by opening up the free market, lots of different avenues, solutions to these communication issues might happen, and by any kind of regulation might limit those or stop them from emerging as quickly. So a solution will find a way, and people will get their